So thank you all for coming today. I'm very happy to present to you our speaker, and I'm going to let him introduce himself and explain his background and how he got interested in storytelling. Craig DeLarge.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so I'm Craig DeLarge, and it's a pleasure to be here to speak to you today. Liesl, thank you again for the invitation. I really appreciate it. I always enjoy an opportunity to come out and talk about research that I did when I was a graduate student, where what you're about to see here is at least 6 months of my life, so I can empathize with the circumstances that you guys are in as students. And when you're sitting in the library sometimes thinking to yourself, I'm doing this research, I wonder if anyone's ever going to read this stuff or ask me to talk about it ever. I hope I give you some hope around that. So anyway, who am I? And I'm going to move very quickly here, and I'm happy to take questions as we go through this, as my objective today is less to get through all of my presentation than to make sure that you actually get from this presentation what's beneficial for you. And of course, after the presentation, I'm happy to share copies of the thesis paper that I wrote, as well as the slides that I'll be presenting, as well as a delicious bookmark list that I have on the internet that has a lot of the research sources that I use, both in this research as well as in my ongoing research in this area. So anyway, my day job, although I'm on my lunch hour right now, is such that I'm the Associate Director of Relationship Marketing at Novo Nordisk, which is the Danish diabetes healthcare company headquartered in Copenhagen, Denmark, but headquartered here in the United States in Princeton, New Jersey. I'm also an adjunct professor for the last decade and a half at a number of universities here in the area. I'm a life and career coach, which is something that I've been doing for about the last 8 years in particular. And I've kind of included here my blog site that I keep, if any of you are ever interested in that. I have my master's in business administration from the University of Westminster, which is located in London, UK. And my specialty from my graduate work is in the area of design management. I got my degree in 2003. And of course, the research that I'm presenting here today is the dissertation that I wrote in order to get that degree. I am from Philadelphia, so I have my bachelor's degree from what is now Philadelphia University. People as old as myself long for the days when it was the Philadelphia College of Textiles and Science. And of course, I'm a healthcare marketer the last 20 years, where I've spent most of my career at companies like Johnson & Johnson, GlaxoSmithKline, and of course now at Novo Nordisk. And I guess the other thing I should throw in is that Drexel has a special place in my heart because I worked in the bookstore for 3 years when I was an undergrad. So it's always nice to come back to Drexel University for those reasons. So I like to start this presentation with this quote that particularly touches me from all of the research that I did when I was in school. This is by Collison, and what he says is that the story is one of the basic tools invented by the mind of man for the purpose of gaining understanding. There have been great societies that did not use the wheel, but there has been no society that has not used stories. So very often, particularly if you're a science or an engineering historian type, we think about the wheel as kind of one of those pivotal enablers of society. But very often in our education, we've not heard that, in fact, even before the wheel existed, human societies used stories as a way of creating understanding. And one might say that every culture, every society that exists is founded on some set of stories or narratives. And when we commonly believe in those stories or narratives, we see them as truth, we see them as defining of our identity. That's when we put a label on it and we call ourselves that. Everything from American to male or female to Republican or Democrat, and I could go on and on and on. But all of these identities are related to a particular story or narrative. So anyway, to give you some background here, the key questions that we examined in this research was the idea of, is storytelling a critical success factor in relationships between the clients and the consultants that work in the design communications area. Now, the reason that it was defined so specifically is because the context of this program was design management, and a lot of the work that I was doing was related to professional services firm management. But understand that even though the research is specific, I think that its findings and applications are general to most any type of relationship in general, but business relationships in particular, and obviously that's what we're going after here. So the first thing was to determine, is it a critical success factor? And the second is, if and when it is a critical success factor, the first question, how is it applied? Now, appreciate that a limitation of this research is that I did not have the time to actually delve into the question of how stories are used, nor did I have the opportunity to delve into why stories are used. So that's a caveat and a limitation of the research that I like to state up front. The methodology that I used was a rather extensive literature review in the area of storytelling, but also consulting. I had the benefit of the Design Management Institute's membership list. So that's how I was able to find 584 design and communications professionals. What was really gratifying about this, though, is that my professor kind of told me up front, you can go ahead and do this research, but you realize if you don't get enough responses, you may have to start all over again. And so it was quite gratifying to see that a full 16.7% of the respondents were actually interested enough in this topic that they were willing to fill out what was not a small survey that I issued as a part of this. And then, of course, I followed that up in order to get some in-depth insights with interviews with certain of the survey respondents. And as I recall, I think on top of this 96 respondents, I probably interviewed a good 10 of them in order to get deeper insights. The key questions that were asked in the measurement instrument had to do with asking people, so what are the critical consultant relationship success factors that you tend to run into in relationships either with your clients if you're a consultant or with consultants if you happen to be a client. After establishing what those success factors are, I then asked about the whole question of, I defined a set of story forms, which I'll talk about, and then I simply asked them, in your day-to-day work, do you use or witness these forms of stories? Then I asked them what situations those stories happen to be a critical success factor, and then of course delved into some of the benefits that they might derive from the use of stories. So what I'll go through right now is some quick definitions and talk a bit about my literature review before I actually get into the research findings, where I want to leave time towards the end for a lot of questions. And then certainly I'll be available to you via the internet when this whole thing is all done. So anyway, what is the story? Boge, who was one of my favorite sources in this research, says that any time that you have an oral or written performance that involves two or more people, where the intention is to interpret experience, either to verify that there is a variance in how we're experiencing something, but even more so to verify that there's a commonality of experience that we are both kind of interacting with in the world. You have a story. Volpe says that when you have a sequence of dramatic events that evoke an emotional response, you have a story. And one might say that, in the explanation of anything, there are the facts, and then there's the story. The facts are the thing that leaves you kind of cold, very objective. But when we begin to inject meaning and plot and setting, the things that we learned when we took English in school and literature in school, now we begin to bring an emotional component into it. And I would say that by and large, the beauty and the productive element of stories is that while facts may move us in our minds, stories move us in our heart and in our soul. While facts may inform us, stories are what incite us to action and to commitment. And I would dare say that while we as business and information scholars are very much into the facts, and I get that, there's certainly a purpose for that, making those facts real in a way that people are willing to take action around that has a lot to do with the story that we tell about those facts that we derive. So anyway, Boyce goes on to say that stories are a preferred sense-making currency in human relationships. And I think what's important there is the term of currency. It's something that we use as a means of exchange. We give it in order to get something from someone else. And then Vincent, and he's a marketing writer, talks about the idea that when you have this arc, what we call it, a situation, a complexity or crisis, and then a resolution. I think it was either Aristotle or Plato who originally defined that as the basis of a dramatic arc. Okay? Actually, Vincent, in his research, an interesting aside, talks about the fact that he believes that fully 25 to 30% of our economy is story-driven. So you think about all of the industries that, of course, just the other night, most of us spent a whole evening, right, engaging in the Oscars, which is one of the top story-making industries that we're exposed to on an ongoing basis. So this thing of a story is not a small thing. So I'm all excited doing this research. I'm talking to my professor about story this, story that, and she says to me, well, you realize that that's all good and fine to be excited about, but Craig, if you don't put some objective parameters around what kinds of story, what forms of stories, you won't be able to actually complete your research. So that sent me to work doing a lot of reading of a lot of sources in which I was able to triangulate and come up with this collection of story types and forms. Now, the reason I use that word triangulate is because in a broad reading of the literature, you see pretty consistently that researchers and scholars will use these types of terminologies or typologies, if you will, in their attempt to kind of sort out beyond just story what types of stories people tend to use. So the major ones that we came up with, and which were also the basis of the measurement scale that I used in my research, were hero stories. And how many of you have ever read Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces? I highly recommend it. And if you don't have time to read because you're saving your eyes for the research that you need to do, you can get it in audio and actually listen to it. It's quite a good listen to. In any case, the hero story is about the person that we laud, that we use as a model. You have different types of heroes, comedic, tragic, so forth and so on. But whenever we're standing up and kind of pointing out some individual or group as a model to be emulated, or maybe not emulated, that's a form of hero story. The other is the survivor story. This is when we all sit around and we talk about the idea that we went through a very difficult time, but man, didn't we survive that together? In many ways, one might say that for American society, and maybe even the world, 9/11 has quite well become a survivor story for us as a society. It's something that we have survived. We have found a way to get through it. We found a way to learn from it and to move on. Steam valve stories are what I like to call kvetching stories. This is when someone comes in your office and they sit down, or you go in someone's office and you just need to fume. You need to let off steam. And this is a particular type of story that one might say has quite good emotional and therapeutic effect, which is one of the reasons that human beings are such professional complainers. The Aren't We Great story is the situation where, once again, we take pride in who we are as a culture or identity. We Know the Ropes is an experiential story. This is a story that speaks to the idea that in this organization, in this culture, there are certain people or individuals or subgroups within that culture, and they know the ropes. They know the unwritten rules. They know the unspoken norms. They know how to work around, within, and through standard documented procedure in order to really get things done. So that's the We Know the Ropes. The kick in the seat of the pants story is when management stands up and says, look here, you guys, see, we got to get this done or we might be all out of here. It's time to cut the messing around. I'm kicking you in the seat of the pants. We have to get this done. And very often, management will use these stories as cautionary tales as to what we need to do differently in order to avoid some disaster. Learning from mistakes, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Trust stories, or stories that have the particular purpose of trying to establish some degree of emotional or psychological connection, such that we're able to get beyond beyond transactional relationship, simple tit for tat, I give you $1, you give me an orange, whatever, to a transformational relationship, where there is what one might say a spiritual or an emotional element to it, where maybe it's going too far to say that we would die for one another. So we wouldn't die for one another literally, but we would certainly go beyond kind of standard documented service level agreement in wanting to be willing to extend ourselves to help one another. Positive competitor stories are the stories that you tell when you want to shame the organization in doing better because the organization is doing better than you are. I like to use those a lot at work, particularly with my management. Then, of course, appreciate that. So one might say that these are concrete forms of stories. Stories as we think of a story when one uses the term story. But I also found in my research that there are what we might call abstract forms of stories. Rites of passage of all sorts are stories. It's not a story that's told, it's a story that's enacted. Graduation in society is a story. The reason we work so hard to pursue graduations and certifications of various types is because it is as though we were living out the narrative of a particular type of hero so that we also can be a part of that narrative. And of course, we take great pride in it. I mean, you saw in my letters I put up front, right? That time and effort that I put into my BS and my MBA, I like to put that up there because I have lived that narrative. That is a significant rite of passage for me in my life. Okay? And there's a definite story behind that. It's a story enacted versus a story that is told. Rites of exchange, rites of communion, rites of affliction, or one might call hazing. One could very well say that graduate programs in and of themselves are rites of affliction. Right? I'm sure you feel that on a regular basis. The point being is that when you get through it, you have the badge of honor that goes with all of the work and effort and blood, sweat, and tears that you put in that. It puts you in a new class. It separates you from the rest of society in a way. So anyway, understand that rights in and of themselves within organizations and cultures are stories and narratives of a sort. Physical objects, in fact. Within our society, there are certain icons, you might call it. Certain buildings, certain sculptures, certain pieces of art, certain types of cars. Designed physical objects carry a narrative and a story for many subgroups within given societies, in which case they also are abstract forms of stories. And then people in and of themselves. So, you know, whatever you think about Barack Obama one way or the other politically, certainly you would have a difficult time disclaiming that he embodies a certain narrative that very many people can associate with and see as something that in their own way is worth striving for in their own lives. Thus, in leaders, we have a form of embodied story or narrative. And then finally, games, which I found really interesting. So you recognize, or maybe you don't, that the video game industry, I think within the last 3 years, is now a larger industry than Hollywood. Did you realize that? More money is being made by video games than by movies. In fact, no, I won't stretch it and say books and movies. We'll just stick with movies. But I wouldn't doubt that it's getting close to actually besting books also. Why? Video games are definitely the simulation games, are narratives. They are narratives that you can step inside of and actually live, immerse in the experience of the hero that is the protagonist within that story. And of course, this is one of the reasons why people so much get into them. So anyway, a lot of work here in terms of defining this, and this became the basis for how we then approached the setting up of our measurement instrument. So I then had to do additional research as a part of my literature review to delve into, so what do scholars and theorists have to say about the key applications of stories? And by the way, I should also say that you actually, in the literature, may not see the word story as much as you see narrative. Narrative is actually a more oft-used academic terminology by researchers and theorists in the literature than story. Story is frankly more of a colloquialism and an informal terminology that people use. But in any case, these are the key applications I uncovered. Knowledge transfer and learning. And when we talked earlier about the sense-making currency, the way of gaining common understanding, that's where knowledge transfer and sharing is an application of stories. Sense-making, which I've alluded to. It was really surprising to me to find that the articulation and visualization of strategy, where the definition of strategy I like to use is, strategy is what you do to gain advantage in any competitive situation. You could very well say that advantage is the synonym of strategy. So whatever you need to articulate or visualize for a group, what we need to do to gain advantage, the use of stories is a very compelling use of articulating that to the group that has to execute. I've already alluded to the fact that cultures in and of themselves are founded on stories. Unfortunately, even if it's a lie, people will more readily believe it if it's embedded in a compelling story that connects with them. Setting expectations and gaining attention. Stories are good for that. And very importantly, so I actually read an article last week preparing for this where the author talked about the idea that a key difference between knowledge and information is context. So I have a lot of facts and information, but in order for it to become actionable, useful knowledge, it must be set in a certain context. One might say that story is almost always the context that I build around the facts in order to get people to understand it, to buy into it, and to be willing to do something with it, as well as to understand and know how to apply it. Cowley talks about the idea that the human psyche is almost hardwired to collapse experience into narrative structures in order to make sense. And this gets back to that idea of there's the facts and there's the stories. I would dare say that most of the arguments that occur between my wife and I, we've been married for 20 years now, is because we both see the same facts, but we tell a different story about those facts. And most of the work of our relationship, however successful or not it is about communicating in a way that we can reconcile the different stories that we both told about the identical facts. So this is where skillfulness in storytelling, in building relationship, and being savvy in understanding other people's stories as well as conscious of your own in order to reconcile them is critically, critically important. It'll help you at work. It'll help you even more at home. Film Lee talks about the idea that good storytelling. He relates design and storytelling in a way that he talks about that it makes a connection with others that translates into meaning and purpose, which I thought was important. Barry talks about the idea that strategy is the most costly story that any organization tells. And I can tell you that when I go to work and I talk to my manager about storytelling, they immediately go, storytelling? We don't tell stories. We're serious around here. We're a business. We're trying to make money. Don't talk to me about stories. So then I use terms like, well, we need to talk about the value proposition. And then they go, oh, now I see. But they don't appreciate that that is just a Trojan horse manner of saying the same thing, right? And so I would further add that when the CEO has to go before Wall Street every quarter and do the briefing, which is going to make or break the analyst's story that they tell to the investors about whether this is a buy, a hold, or an unload, what is the CEO doing? They're telling a story. The degree to which those analysts and the investors buy into it or not makes or breaks the fortunes of the investors, the 401ks, and that whole deal. Stories influence the action, the understanding, and the commitment that people invest in strategy. And this is a very important one. To the degree that all culture of any size is based on what type of discourses and conversations are happening within that, storytelling plays a key role in shaping what we understand about the past, where are we coming from, where do we see ourselves going, futuristic perspective, and it becomes the key agenda of discourse within the organization, even though those fight against one another. One might very well say that most of the energy used in organizational politics is the fight over what will the discursive agenda be for this period of time and for this challenge that we have to face. It's true of organizations. It's true of our society. What are we watching on the news every day now? The story that the Obama administration and the Republican Congress, at least the minority part of the Republican Congress, they're telling two different stories, and they're trying to reconcile their view of similar facts and to get the American people to buy in and to support one strategy or approach or another. So, I say that to really help you to appreciate that in many ways with this topic, we're fish in water. We're immersed in an environment of narrative and storytelling all the time, but completely unaware of it, and all the time being influenced by it. I'll pick up the pace here now. I've kind of made these points already, The idea, organizations are storytelling systems that contain simultaneous and competing discourses, to the point that I've made earlier. Leadership. Very critical that there is story compatibility between the leader and the follower. Followers reject their leaders when the leader is not able to tell a compatible story. Very important. In change management, expressing the need for change, the process by which we will change, and the outcome that we envision even before it occurs, always embedded in the story, whether we call it that or not. And one might say that when you cannot get good change or effective change, it is because the leadership has failed in their ability to convey a compatible and a compelling and a cohesive story that connects with the followers. And I think it's important to further add that not only must you tell a good story, but you must find ways of continually telling that story over and over again, using both concrete and abstract forms of storytelling in doing that. And I'll go just one, actually, I'll talk about that a bit later. Okay, so, well, there it is. So, the big aha from my research is I went into the research thinking storytelling. I'm going to do all this research and talk about how people tell stories. But the really big aha was story listening. Story listening. So, it caught me completely off guard. Story listening is actually a more critical management skill. Maybe I'm overstating the case. At least as important a management skill as storytelling. Story listening is a window into culture, into history, into worldview, into value systems and preferences. Our ability in this context as consultants to sit and not just see what other people are saying as, well, they're just talking about whatever. They're communicating information. But to really listen with a second ear into the things that I'm hearing them say over and over again. What is the setting that they seem to be obsessed with? What is the tension? I'm talking about the arc now, right? Okay, what is the tension that continually comes up in what I'm listening to my client talk about? What is the resolution or the future that they seem to be wanting to lead towards? When I go into an organization, do I hear a consistent number of managers articulating the same story? Or do I hear a lot of different stories? This gives clues and insight into the politics, the culture, the motivations, and into the priorities of any organization. But I know that for most of my life, I just, I don't listen to my management through the filter of a story or a narrative, nor do I listen to the people that work for me, let alone my wife and children, who are the most important people of all, right? And so in this research, it really struck me, this idea that I need to really cultivate the skill of not just listening to the facts, but listening to the stories that people are telling. And I need to actually look for patterns within the stories that I'm listening to and use that as the basis for taking effective action in how I relate to people and achieve certain ends in relationship. This second point just, Maester, and Maester, by the way, for any of you who have a particular interest in consultancy or professional service business models, Maester is one of the foremost. He's not an academic, actually. He's a what you might call a scholar practitioner, and he's written quite a number of really good books about consulting that I would refer you to. In any case, he talks about the idea that story listening sets up a systematic way of tracking preferences, desires, and requirements. It's actually a form of service development. If you listen well to the stories that clients are telling, you not only know how to give them more of what they want, but you can actually go and create what they don't even know they want yet, which keeps you ahead in the marketplace. So, that was my literature review. And I feel just as breathless actually relating it to you as I did when I was actually doing the research several years ago. So now let's get into the findings themselves. And Lisa, how am I doing on time?
You got about 25 minutes to finish up, so...
Okay, so I'm going to go through this pretty quick. Okay, all right.
Move it along.
Okay, so these are the key questions. This one is probably less relevant to what we're talking about today, but just note that this is what the 96 people who replied said. This is what I want from in a relationship that I have with a consultant or client. I then posed the question to them, so, when you use or witness stories, can everybody see the bottom of this okay? I'm sorry about that. I'll talk about it in detail. But when I posed the question, so what forms of stories? And understand, related to that prior slide I showed you, in the research instrument questionnaire, I had to define, I had to list the stories, and then I had to define for them what I meant by the story, so that there would not be confusion in terms of the results or the feedback that we got in these results. But in any case, when we ask this question of what story forms do you use or witness in consulting relationships, what we found is that nicely, the use of stories is prevalent. So, good. That begins to get me towards a positive answer to my question. The second thing we found is that consultants tell, clients witness. So you see this clear trend. The one is sitting and listening and the other is doing a lot of talking. But the implication of this gets to this, that consultants are probably doing too much telling and versus listening, and clients are probably doing too much listening versus telling. And of course, the result of that is usually a poor project outcome, because the person who's being served isn't communicating enough about what they want. And the person whose job it is to serve is in fact doing so much talking, usually out of nervousness about what they want to offer, that they're not getting the right requirements to deliver what it is they're being paid to deliver. So that was quite an interesting insight. Anyway, when we look at the story forms, you see that trust, learning from mistakes, events, competitive stories, and survival stories were the top used. But you see that there's kind of a disconnect here of sorts, because how smart we are, how great we are, hero stories, trust stories, and learning from mistake is what the client is hearing. So the client remembers that. I hear these people talking about how great and smart they are, but the consultant thinks that they're talking about, so you see this disconnect. You see the connections you see, though, is trust and learning from mistakes are the two things that kind of match up in the top 5. But I thought that was quite interesting. And of course, it gets back to this idea that same facts, different stories. One's telling one thing, someone else is hearing something else, almost entirely. And I'll go by this chart because you can take a look at this later. Now, we then went and asked the questions, okay, so you use stories, you witness stories, but in what situations do you find them to be a critical success factor? And here you have it. So the top 4 situations where stories are used as a critical success factor: when I need to get people to change, people or organizations to change; when I'm articulating strategy, so I'm talking about advantage, the change that advantage will give us, and why you need to be bought in and committed to helping us with this; when I'm trying to build a team, and of course the crux of building teams is building trust. So you see kind of a correlation between what you saw on the other slide and what you see here. And then, of course, when we need to innovate or be creative, those are the top situations where there's a use. When you go to the other side, while you see that the order of witnessing is different, there is pretty much consistency from a situational standpoint between what people are using and what people are witnessing. And I'll go by these slides because this is just the visual of what I had said earlier. So then I asked a question related to, so what are the key benefits that you personally derive from the use of stories? And these were the verbatims that I got from a combination of the survey and the interviews. And of course, I don't think there are really any surprises here. When you're presenting strategy, demonstrating leadership, storytelling in the use of negotiation, training to the extent that training is a form of culture building, you see the connection there. Because if I'm being trained to be a part of a group, the stories that I'm told in training are what help me to take on the identity and the norms of that group, which is the reason why the group doesn't get rid of me. This is the reason why if you fail in training, organizations fire you. You have not qualified to be a member of that culture and that group. But of course, one of my interviewees had said, I find that when I'm training new staff, if I use stories about interactions we've had with clients, the history of the organization, what the organization is about, those people do better than if I just give them a book with a bunch of facts and say, read this manual and go do your job. So I thought that was a rather compelling insight. We talked about change, innovation, creativity. Managing conflict is quite interesting. The insight there, as I recall, is that this reconciliation of stories that I talked about me and my wife earlier, right? The conflict is caused because we perceive a different story of the same facts. The reconciliation of our stories, either meeting in the middle or someone dropping theirs and going to someone else's, is a specific skill when it comes to managing conflict. Team building we talked about. Marketing is all around you. I could substitute this with branding. And there's a library of books about how brands are narratives, and they tie into archetypes and Jungian psychology and all that sort of stuff that I could recommend to you. Stimulating dialogue, exploring the future, and clarifying roles and responsibilities. Where very often I find it work. If I'm trying to get across the point with someone on my team what their role and responsibilities are, giving them a narrative example goes a lot better than giving them a job description. Or certainly after I've given them the job description, I need to then talk about specific stories of situations that they'll be in and how I want them to act in those situations. Other key learnings. Story listening. There it goes again. Both verbally and non-verbally. Now there's a key thing there. When you're listening to a story, you not only listen to the words, you listen to the body language, the facial expressions, right? Kind of the tics and quirks that help you to see one level in to what's going on with a person when they're telling the story. It definitely gives you an advantage from the standpoint of relationship and communications. And then this is a very important one. So I'm talking very casually about storytelling, but my interviewees made it very clear to me that very many times they told stories and failed. Storytelling is very risky. Telling good stories requires some insight into the culture of the listener. You have to be able to tell a story in a way that connects. Otherwise, you may well have just recited facts. And of course, the great risk of storytelling is that if you get the context wrong, people end up offended and insulted, which is quite easy to do if you are telling a story to people who you don't have some degree of cultural affinity with, or at the very least, a knowledge of cultural background and their preferred context. So this is where we talk about the fact that storytelling is what I call a high-risk, high-reward scenario. And the more critical, the higher the anxiety level is around change, the greater degree of conflict there is around a disconnect between the story that we're both telling around the same facts, the higher risk it is. Which just simply means that you do more homework before you get up on stage or go into a room using stories with that particular person, and you certainly modify the type and form of story that you would use so that you kind of feel your way through. But understand, I don't want you to be cavalier with this form of communication because it can backfire. It can backfire. So key applications. And this is now the pragmatic side of it. So you do all that academic research, and then the professor has the nerve to say, well, because this is an MBA, a business program, you've got to actually come up with recommendations for management. And I thought it was purely an academic exercise. But the point is that So we have the facts, but always ask, what's the story here? What's the story here? I find that on an ongoing basis with my clients and people that work for me, and even my management, we'll be preparing for a communication or a presentation or a workshop. And then after we've gotten all the facts together, I'll say, okay, so what's the story here? What is the narrative arc that we need to encapsulate these facts in order to elicit that emotional response, to get that degree of commitment that people are going to now act upon, that's going to trigger and enhance that greater degree of memory, believability, and commitment that we had talked about earlier. Practicing active story listening, and this is indeed a practice. Recruiting storytellers and encouraging storytellers is the advice that I would give to the leader of organizations. So, you know, when you interview people for jobs, listen to how they tell stories. Maybe even give them storytelling exercises. Certainly look at courses in storytelling and encourage your top managers to go and really learn the craft of storytelling. Because the higher you go in an organization, the more communication is your contribution than actually doing the work. Thus, your ability to tell good stories that get lower levels of the organization to actually take better action becomes more critical to the success of the organization itself. So recruiting storytellers and encouraging it is important. And then finally, leveraging stories as an evidence of service. So evidence of service is a term that comes out of the research that I did on the consulting side. So, you know, services are intangible. They're not products that sit on the shelf where you can pick it up and handle it. So it's very important when you're in a consulting mode that as you're acting out your service, that there are certain evidences of service. It might be documents. Well, I'll leave it at that. Certain various types of documents are the most prevalent evidence of service. But the point that this researcher made is that using stories as an evidence of service is very important. And the nice news here is that most consultancies don't know how to do it, which means it's easier for you to gain a strategic advantage. Anything that's difficult to do always gives you the greatest opportunity for strategic advantage because it can't be easily imitated. Using stories to build culture, build brands, transfer knowledge, and demonstrate leadership, I think are immediately for managers the most, how do I say, the greatest return on investment, if you will, is to be gained, I believe, from using storytelling within these particular applications. Further reading that I would offer to you, so Stephen Denning, former director at the World Bank, has made a small industry. We were talking about this earlier, Lisa, out of writing books about organizational narrative and storytelling. The best one that I've read, because it is the broadest read of the topic within one of his books, is The Leader's Guide to Storytelling. And I highly recommend it. And he's quite an affable guy. He does a lot of workshops, and he's very accessible at his website. We'll answer email, we'll pick up the phone and talk to you. So if you're doing any research in this area, I highly recommend talking with him. Neuhauser, who wrote the book Corporate Legend and Lore, was also a very helpful book that I found, because she delved into how stories are used around what she calls the organizational campfire. So, you know, remember when you were kids, or maybe not, you go to camp and you sit around at night and tell stories. Okay, maybe under the sheets with a flashlight, but some kind of storytelling when you were a kid. And so she talks about how we grow up and go to work in organizations, but it's the same thing. We're all sitting around like little kids telling each other stories and either believing or disbelieving or arguing over them. And that forms the basis for organizational culture. Vincent in Legendary Brands talks extensively about the marketing and branding applications of storytelling. And it's a very good read. And of course, the best of them all, Joseph Campbell, who is one of the foremost scholars and academicians in the area of myth and religion and legend. And this book, Heroes of a Thousand Faces, this is like, you can't die without reading or listening to this book. Trust me, trust me. So, I'll leave us with this. One of the two reasons that business models tend to fail, the other one doesn't really matter in this presentation, but this is the important one. Story failure. When the story fails, the business model fails. Why? You can't get the buy-in of the stakeholders. And even if you get them initially, you have to continue to reshape and realign and retell that story to keep them engaged. That's every customer with the brand, every stakeholder, every investor, every employee. So we have to watch against story failure. So this is how to get in touch with me. I'm all over the internet, easily Googleable, as they say. And I'd be happy as a fellow researcher and scholar practitioner to be engaged with you on this topic on an ongoing basis. So, questions?
Questions? Come on, somebody else has
Okay, I'll take a swig of water while I'm
Can you give us an example of a situation where you use, if
Yes.
you see it, if
Yes.
you see it more. I understand in theory, but
Okay.
give me an example.
Yes. So, and I can get you a copy of this article. There's an article that I wrote for the Design Management Journal based on this research. And the editor said asked me that same question. So, I included an example. When I used to be at J&J Merck, I was a product director for Pepsid AC. And we were in a situation where we were second in the market and behind Zantac. And we had a rather demoralized sales force. I was in charge of professional marketing, so we marketed to doctors versus consumers. So the vice president and I were sitting around and we're trying to figure out, so we've got this product. We're the third product in the sales call list, which means the representatives almost never get to talk about us. We don't have a huge budget. We got to find a way to inspire them to really make our product a priority. So I use the narrative arc. When I would go to sales meetings and make presentations to sales management, I began to make the battle between Pepsid AC and Zantac like an epic conflict. And I would talk about, we're the underdog and we're the David and Goliath. I mean, when telling stories and you understand the culture, the fact is that in every culture there are certain kind of embedded scenarios, right? If I say to you David and Goliath, pretty much everyone in Western society, at least Judeo-Christian society, gets that, right? The big guy, the small guy, the underdog beats the big dog, that kind of thing. And this is where it gets important to understand the audience you're talking to. But when we would get up in front of the sales force and we would start talking about the idea that, you guys, at the end of the day, yeah, we got to make money, and yeah, we want to gain market share. But what you need to really understand is that we're Johnson & Johnson, and we're accustomed to being market leaders. And that we are second in the market against GlaxoSmithKline with that product is just, it's unacceptable. We have the means and the skill and the smarts and the ability to drive, and we're going to give you some innovative ways of doing it. And we beat that drum all year. In every written communication, in every spoken communication. If the VP and I made up our minds that there were certain sound bites that we were going to embed around this epic struggle. If I passed you in the hallway, I was going to drop something in there related to our epic struggle against Zantac. Right? And really it's no different than what the government and the press, and marketing companies do all the time. Right? It's the unique value proposition. And we saw, I'm happy to say that, the sales force got emotionally, engaged. And we saw that, that market share kind of trickle up. By the time I left the job, we were back to number one. Now, am I going to say that happened entirely because of the story? No, I'm not going to go that far. But do I believe that our ability to break through, arrest people's attention, gain their commitment, and get their ongoing, consistent action towards a future that we had painted for them was because we were consistently hammering that story? Yeah, I believe that. Yeah. And there are many other examples that I could offer if I had more time, but which The literature in this area has grown significantly. You know, as I was preparing for this talk last week, so I did this research in 2003, and there was adequate research, but it wasn't easy getting at it. So I went the other day, and I put some messages up on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, and just kind of asking. I'm doing this, I'm trying to get myself up to speed on the latest research in the area of storytelling. I'm amazed, just from 03 to 09, that's 6 years, the number of consultancies, articles, publications, Harvard Business Review. I mean, people that when I was doing this research originally would have laughed you out of the room if you even mentioned the word story, are taking this as a serious business and management skill and discipline now. And there's not a little bit of research. Well, actually, I shouldn't say there's not a little bit. Let's just say that there is a fairly significant amount of research around knowledge management specific application of narrative and storytelling, to the extent that context is important, and to the extent that an emotional connection to the knowledge results in greater commitment and application of the knowledge. Yeah. Okay.
Somebody here has a
Okay.
question?
It's not extremely relevant, so someone else has a question.
It's not. Never say that
No,
about your
that's fine.
question.
No, it's more about like your career. So.
Oh yeah, we can talk about that later. You're right. That is not as relevant. Okay, fair point. All right.
I wanted to ask a question regarding story listening. You mentioned that, being able to be a listener, of stories and figuring out patterns through that listening method. What kinds of patterns have you observed or have you found in story listening?
Okay. So I would say that the patterns are truly specific to situation and culture. When I was in consulting, here's a better example. When I was at Johnson & Johnson, right, there are a whole set of narratives and stories that you internalize and you learn through training and witnessing when you're in that culture. A lot of it is embedded in the Johnson & Johnson credo, which is kind of, in the company, on every manager's wall, there's the credo. And it's these dictates, I'll call them, or principles around what our business is about, the importance of the customer and the whole thing, right? And so, as you walk around the company, they trained us that you talk about this all the time. How many of you remember, not many of you would remember the Tylenol poisoning incidences that happened back in the 80s, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so you might also remember that J&J was uncharacteristic in how they handled that. Jim Burke, the CEO at the time, did not take the view of it's somebody else's fault, but J&J offered to take back all of that product, lost, millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars taking back the product, and eventually took capsules off the market because they were unsafe for them, right? Well, years and years after that, because I was a teenager when that happened, because my dad worked for J&J, I'm now in my 30s, a manager at J&J, and we would sit around the table and tell each other stories like, so if we make this decision, what would Jim Burke think about that? Will we be able to pass the Jim Burke Tylenol poisoning test? Right? So when you're, but yet I've talked to other managers at other companies, and you bring up an ethical sort of problem like that, they'll tell you a different kind of story. They'll tell you a story about how, we need to make money and just get the lawyers in here, we'll figure out how to cover it up otherwise. The lawyers have to take care of it versus the management has to take care of it. It's difficult to get specific without a particular context, but understand that when you develop the practice, and that's the hardest part, and you practice it in certain cultures over long spans of time, the same way that you become an expert researcher is because you spend hours and hours with the literature, with your colleagues, in the library, on the internet, and you get this kind of embedded, almost sixth sense. You develop the ability to quote the sources, and the methodologies and the constructs and the theories. Well, understand this is the same way. You know, I can walk in a room now, 20 years into my career, and I can listen to managers talk about things, and almost intuitively, I can pick up on certain patterns in what I'm hearing. This is where they talk about it takes 10 years to become an expert and 20 years to become an overnight success. Right? And so it's kind of a wisdom that you develop through years and years of practice. It's not to say that it can't be useful to you unless you hang around for a couple of decades, but it is something that you want to learn, and there are courses you can take on it, by the way, and books you can read about it, but it ripens. It's a skill that ripens with time and experience. I hope that answers it, although I'm not sure it did.
Okay, well, I think one more question, or we'll just take questions informally up here in the front and come talk to Craig.
Okay. Thank you all again
Thank
very
you
much.
very much.
I appreciate it.